Renaissance people. During the Renaissance, most Europeans lived in the countryside, but many people began to move to cities and towns. They hoped to practice a trade in town workshops, study in city schools, or work as servants in townhouses. Cities soon became very crowded. Peasants. Peasant men and women spent their lives growing crops and raising animals from which they produced food and clothing for their families, for nobles, called lords, and for sale in nearby towns. Peasants lived and worked on the lord's estate, which included the lord's house or villa, peasant huts, stables, fields, orchards, vineyards, fish ponds, and pastures. Some peasants, called serfs, were given land to farm, but had to farm the lord's land a few days each month and were never allowed to leave the estate. Other peasants, called free peasants, rented land from the lord, did not have to work in the lord's fields, and could leave the estate if they wanted. All peasants paid taxes and fines to the lord in cash or in produce from the land. Most peasants lived in small 1- or 2-room houses attached to the pen where they kept their animals, such as a cow, some pigs, chickens, goats, or sheep. Chemistry and alchemy. Some scientists who worked with chemicals in the Renaissance were known as alchemists. Early alchemists were interested in changing less valuable metals, such as lead, into gold or finding a potion that would cure all illnesses. They failed, but their work in classifying and comparing different substances and how they reacted with one another led to the modern science of chemistry. Anatomy. Before the Renaissance, doctors' knowledge of health and the body was based on ancient texts filled with many incorrect theories. Medieval scientists were not allowed to dissect human corpses to find out how the body really worked because the church believed that dissection took away the dignity of the deceased person. A great advance in anatomy came in 1543 when Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish doctor, began dissecting and studying human bodies, usually those of executed criminals. He wrote a book based on his findings about the structure of the human body and how its organs, muscles, and bones worked. Doctors gradually rejected the old theories and began to observe patients directly, gathering more accurate information on how the body was made up and how it functioned. Vesalius is sometimes referred to as the father of anatomy because he was the first scientist to dissect, describe, and detail the human body in drawings. Oil paint. Northern European artists such as Jan and Hubert van Eyck began to experiment with oils mixed with pigments. Oil paints dried slowly and gave artists more time to paint. Oils could also be painted on top of one another and blended to create different textures and shades of light and dark. Architecture. Ancient Roman ruins surrounded Italian architects of the Renaissance. These men studied the ancient buildings and copied the designs. They borrowed the ideas of round columns, wide arches, spacious interiors, and large domes in their work. Architects also studied mathematics to make their buildings, bridges, and gardens symmetrical and proportional with regular and balanced patterns. Sculpture and relief. Renaissance sculptors created large statues, monuments, and fountains. They carved furniture, small metals, and other decorative items for homes, palaces, churches, and other public buildings. They also carved reliefs, which were scenes sculpted out of a flat surface. Sculptors worked with bronze, wood, terracotta, marble, or limestone, and sometimes with more expensive materials such as gold, silver, and ivory. Although much of their work was religious, they also depicted figures from ancient myths and history, as well as patrons, nobles, and military heroes of their day. Filippo Brunelleschi designed and built the dome of the cathedral in Florence after observing the dome of the ancient Pantheon in Rome. His dome was 138 feet or 42 meters wide and 133 feet or 40 meters high.